China's economy is set to surpass America's by 2030, and the country will soon account for half the world's population. And yet, right now, just 4% of Canada's exports are sent to China. There are concerns, of course, about trading practices and labor standards in China, among other things. But according to a new report, Canada has to start growing trade with China if we want to grow our economy. So how is that possible? Edward Greenspan is the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Kevin Lynch is vice chairman of BMO Financial Group and former clerk of the Privy Council. And they join me now in studio. Hi to both of you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Mr. Greenspan, I'll start with you. What preempted this? What prompted this study?
Well, we were looking at a discussion about China. You know, for years now, back to the Harper years, there's been talk, should Canada get into a free trade agreement with China? How does Canada represent its interests best given the growth of China? And Kevin and I we were at a little dinner actually, and there was some conversation about this. And the conversation was not incredibly inspiring. It was a conversation that was very shallow and not very broad and only focused on two issues. And we said, you know, maybe we should throw together a group who can really think about this, a smart group of people who can think about it over a period of time and come up with a policy. And that's what we did, and this is what we came up with.
Mr. Lynch, what is the basic conclusion that your study reaches?
That Canada has to engage more with China. We cannot ignore the world's second largest economy and the largest population base in the world. So the issue is not whether, the issue is how. And I think what we really focused on in the report is how Canada and China should actually deepen their relationship.
And that is a question that we're all talking about, if on a shallow level, but you know, the public at large, given what's happened with the new NAFTA and that special clause that essentially says, you know, don't embark on formal free trade negotiations. So what is the how that your report recommends?
Well, it's a number of things, but I guess the one that relates to that is our view is we should proceed with sectoral agreements, focus on a couple of areas, agriculture, natural resources. The Auto Pact is a great example. We developed the Auto Pact and learned from it and built kind of networks across Canada and the United States. In many ways, that helped us move to the free trade agreement in the late 1980s. And we think a series of sectoral agreements will build momentum, they'll create capacity, they'll create linkages, and they'll build the basis for eventually, if we decide to move to a free trade agreement. But in the interim, we'll actually create more jobs, more kind of growth in the economy, and deepen the linkage between Canada and China.
You know, long before we got to the point, which is you know, a Monday ago, where we saw this clause, you know, we had gone down this path of saying, okay, we don't think we're going to endorse a free trade agreement, and we decided we would not endorse a free trade agreement because we thought that it would take 8 to 10 years to negotiate anything. We thought that we would need to learn to walk before we can run. We thought that we could build momentum off sectors. There were just a lot of reasons why a sectoral agreement seemed much more manageable, much more possible, much more in Canada's immediate interests. And indeed, you know, governments are going to change over 8 to 10 years. Economic cycles are going to change. So it seemed better. And then I think we were as surprised as anybody when we saw the clause 3210 and the way in which it impinged our sovereign choice to do whatever we wanted to do. But people have been pretty confused since then. Well, we can't pursue a discussion with China. Well, we can pursue a discussion with China. What we can't do is pursue a discussion with China on a free trade agreement, which the WTO basically interprets as meaning covering substantially all trade, having a series of agreements in different sectors with dispute settlements around them, with more international cooperation, with a whole bunch of other measures that we introduce in there is a doable proposition.
Is, though, what you're proposing just sort of an incremental way of getting to an FTA, Mr. Lynch?
Well, it's building sectoral relationships that can take you to it, but there's going to be value in each of the sectoral relationships that we actually agree to with the Chinese. If it's in agriculture, it'll be a new market for Canadian agricultural products. If it's in natural resources, we'll do it. So in a sense, each will have a value in and of itself, but a series of them, I think, will build a basis to lead to a potential free trade agreement if the political conditions are favorable for that. And
let me ask you about those political conditions, because do you think, for example, the U.S. has, they called it a poison pill, this clause. They're hoping to send a very direct message to China, a continental message. If Canada starts pursuing sectoral agreements with China, does that not fly in the face of the message that the U.S. says it wants to send?
Well, we don't think so. I think that there's two issues that we have to think about at the same time. One is that we've seen the weakness of Canada because we are so dependent on the United States for trade. So we have no bargaining power in a negotiation. We're one of the most trade-dependent major economies in the world. So we need to diversify. This government put the word diversification in the name of the Minister of International Trade. Now it's time to put some meat on that. And you can't diversify without China. China its growth is equal to Europe and the Americas combined year after year. It's more than the rest of Asia combined. So that's the first point, is that we have to do that. The second point I'd make is that the United States actually exports more proportionally to China than Canada.
I saw in your report, twice as much almost.
8.4, twice as much as Canada. So at least until we hit the United States standard, which would be adding as much trade as we currently have, for instance, with South Korea. We have very little with North Korea. As much trade as we have with South Korea, India, and Japan combined. That would only hit the U.S. level of trade with China. I think until then, we probably can justify it.
Mr. Lynch, why do you think successive Canadian governments have struggled so much with this? And both have said, the last two, for this one and the one before it, they want to pursue deepening that trade relationship. They want to diversify trade, but it hasn't been able to materialize. And what is your advice, based on what you've studied, to governments to ensure that the model that, if they should they choose to pursue, actually deepening that trade relationship, it works?
Well, first, part of the reason why we're trade dependent on the United States is the U.S. was for a long time the fastest growing market, the deepest market, the richest market, and we had pretty unique access to that market. So it made a lot of business sense. The problem is that it actually also led to dependency. So the single buyer for our oil is the United States. Gas is trapped in North America. Softwood lumber, our single purchaser in the United States. So in a sense, on the one hand, it was good for us in terms of kind of growing, but on the other hand, it actually led to excessive dependence. And we didn't pivot to other countries the way European countries have. Look at smaller European countries, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands. They trade much more with China because they understood they had to diversify for growth. Two things now is, if we want to have a faster growing economy in the longer term, we've got to trade with faster growing economies. And that's not North America anymore. That's actually China and Asian economies. And secondly, the new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement really does suggest that we have to get serious about trade diversification, because there's strong elements of managed trade in that, whereas we want to actually have freer trade and actually utilize our comparative advantages.
One of the advantages, if you call it that, of negotiating a free trade agreement with another country, or bilaterally or trilaterally, is the idea that, for example, in the new NAFTA, you can talk about wage differentials or labor standards and things like that. In your proposal, would any of that be part of the discussion? Because I think there are genuine concerns from Canadians around, for example, labor standards in China and the disadvantage that might put Canadian businesses at, or things along, those sort of top-level things that get negotiated in FTAs. Would they fall by the wayside in something like you're proposing?
Well, China is, in a transition itself, and it's a transition from an export-based economy to a consumer-based economy. It has a rising middle class, and that middle class is putting a lot of demands on the system in China. So, the middle class put a demand on having more livable cities. The middle class had a consumer rebellion this summer against vaccines, infant vaccines, and we think that Canada fits very well with that, including labor standards, in terms of, okay, here's what workplace safety looks like. Here's what retirement schemes and pension schemes could look like, and livable cities look like. So we think we have a lot to talk about there. There's certain industries that might get hurt, and we've proposed in here there be adjustment policies of the kind that was used for the wine industry in the U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Everybody thought the wine industry was going to get wiped out. But actually what happened was we rebuilt a world competitive, better wine industry out of the adjustment policies that were brought in by the Mulroney government. So we see that kind of thing happening. As far as dumping product in Canada, there are rules against dumping. And those rules, and again, one of the things we talk about is we need to assert our national sovereignty as well. We are a sovereign nation, And we need to have the world understand that we will be as aggressive in our sovereignty as other countries are.
Okay, I have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Mr. Greenspan and Mr. Lynch. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.